podcast is going to look at voting rights and how they are allocated under the LSTA trading documents. So first we're going to look at the par confirm. When two parties enter into a trade, there's a gap between when that trade is entered into and when that trade settles. And in that open time, some action may need to be taken under the credit agreement. So for instance, perhaps a request for an amendment comes up from the borrower during this open period. Seller is still the lender of record because the trade has not settled, but seller has sold on its piece of the loan. So does buyer have the right to vote in that case? Now, under the LSTA par confirm, there is an express requirement that seller does not need to consult with buyer. If you look at section 13 of the par confirm, you'll see that seller does not need to consult with buyer on any decision for any amendment or waiver. While that is true by the document, in truth, market practice generally has sellers consulting with buyers when there's an open trade and amendment needs to be taken. So while there isn't a requirement, we would see typically that a seller would ask down to buyer what action, how they would like to vote, and then would proceed accordingly. Now, of course, seller may hold other parts of positions. It may not be as simple, but that is often, at least the question is asked. So that's under a trade with just a par confirm. But now imagine if you are settling a trade by participation. Now the question of voting is going to be over a longer period. So in section 12 of our par confirm, we do discuss voting in the context of participations. So unless otherwise agreed, when parties are going to settle by participation, they are going to decide whether seller is granting voting rights or not. If seller does grant voting rights, then those rights and the seller's responsibility to take action will be governed by the LSTA form of participation agreement. So if you look at section 12 of the par confirm, we already have that set up. But then let's look at the participation agreement itself, because this is where we'll see more fleshed out provisions around voting. So the parties can choose. Seller can not grant voting rights at all, or seller can grant voting rights with respect to certain rights, or, which is often the case, seller shall grant voting rights. Now, of course, all of this is subject to the credit documents. So many credit agreements will restrict what voting rights seller is able to essentially pass on. Typically, the sacred rights, changes to maturity, to underlying collateral, to interest rate, these are seen as fundamental, and these are rights that are allowed to be passed on to a participant when a seller sells a participation. So we have first the layer of the credit documents, what is allowed to be passed on. Now looking at that universe, we have what of those rights will be passed on to the participant. And all of this is spelled out in the participation agreement form. So in section F, I believe it is, which has the transaction-specific terms around section 11, which are the standard terms governing voting, parties will elect whether voting rights are given, and in which cases. Also, will seller's own position be counted? That's another election under the participation agreement. Moreover, not only seller's position, but seller's affiliates. So these are all options that will be selected and filled out by parties as they're drafting their participation agreement. If you look at the standard terms, in section 11, you'll have section 11A, which has the terms relating to the instances where seller does grant voting rights, and section 11B, which relates to the instances where seller does not grant voting rights. It's important to remember that while seller does have responsibility to act in accordance with the participant's wishes, this is an obligation that is qualified and is limited by some important parameters. First, seller need not take any action which would be in violation of any law or any credit documents. Also, if taking that action would expose seller to any liability for which it has not been adequately indemnified, seller need not take that action. Also, we touched on this a little bit a moment ago, but seller is not necessarily selling all of its position, all of its exposure in the loan in that participation. So seller may still have its own portion, its affiliates may have their own portion, as well as other participants. So since the vote under a credit agreement is indivisible, seller can only act one way. So there's also a majority holders concept. So seller will act in accordance with the wishes of the majority holders. So even if a single participant has made a request for a vote, yay or nay, it may not win the day, depending on the other circumstances. So it's important when thinking about participations that parties are cognizant of the limitations around voting and how it all works.